Thank you for being here. Thank you for coming. It's how are you enjoying the conference so far? Yeah. This is my second DrupalSouth. I'm enjoying it immensely, and not least because it's in New Zealand. It's beautiful. Okay. So the talk here, what I'm going to talk about today, it's about dependency injection, and I'm going to start off with very beginner level stuff, and it's just slides, no demo, but I do have some screenshots, and if you have any trouble like reading the code, just point it out. I'll try zooming in, and maybe we can walk through that. That said, it's not a lot of code driven, it's mostly concepts driven, because you will see dependency injection is quite simple at heart. So my name is Hussain. I go with, okay, I should be speaking to the mic, yeah. So I go with the handle Hussain Web pretty much everywhere, on Twitter, d.o. So if you want to find me, just search for Hussain Web. I work for a company called Accelerant in India. We are an entirely remote working organization, so we have colleagues all over the world. And I work as an engineering manager there. And I deal with all technical best practices and education as well. So yeah, what is dependency injection? And little bit of history here. I've given this talk probably, I don't remember how many times anymore. It's like few cities at least, and every city I go to, I try to find one food item from that particular region and use that in my slides. So I did that, before I was coming to Auckland. I tried to find out, what's the local cuisine, and I found this. Right. So I spoke to a lot of people, and there is some kind of a not a confusion, but Australians are claiming meat pie as theirs. New Zealanders are claiming meat pie as theirs. Today I'm going to claim meat pie for dependency injection. And we are going to make a meat pie today. So we need a chef. We need someone who can make this meat pie. And what do we need? So our chef is going to make this New Zealand style meat pie. Okay, and so okay, I should have mentioned this earlier. I'm going to the code I'm going to demo. It's mostly object oriented. So if you have experience with working with objects in PHP, that's great. But hopefully it should be simple to follow. If you have any questions, feel free to stop me anywhere. So if you can read the class definition, it's quite simple actually. There is a single method called cook, and I'm going to create the pastry. I'm going to create a new pastry for that, some new fillings, and I'm going to add cheese garnish. And then I'm going to cook the meat pie, and I'm going to cook the fillings first. I'm going to prepare the pastry, then prepare the whole thing and put it in the oven to bake it. And that's it. So to use this class, it's way down at the bottom, but it's a single line, just new chef meat pie. You're creating this object, and you have this method called cook, and it does everything. Fine, simple enough, right? So let's see what kind of problems you would face, if you write code like this. Okay, so as the name says that, okay, I'm going to create a meat pie over here, and that's fine, I'm going to create some form of meat pie. What if you don't like cheese? You don't want a cheese garnish on this. Can you change that? It's inside the method. You really can't change that. The only thing you can do at this point is either extend this class and change the whole method, or write your own class. Not a big deal for reusability. Who were in the talk today, earlier today, about unit testing? Okay, few amount of people. Yes, so dependency injection was mentioned over there, and we'll get to that point. So the solution is simple. We are not going to let chef do everything. We're going to give the ingredients to the chef. So in the constructor, I'm actually going to pass the pastry, the fillings, and the garnish. And when I'm going to create this meat pie, I'm just going to create the pastry itself, the fillings, and the garnish, and whatever garnish I want. So now I can actually use any kind of fillings I want. I may want, let's say, vegetarian fillings entirely. I don't want cheese garnish. I don't want any garnish at all. Let's say, now everything is in my control because I have, I'm the one who is creating the object, the chef meat pie, and I am the one who is passing in all the ingredients. It's a simple shift, very simple. It's practically a no-brainer. Right. So what this allows you to do, like I said, so maybe like I want fillings with potatoes. Like I don't know why, but okay, sure, and cheese garnish. So now that is what the object gets created with all these ingredients, and the cook method just cooks. The chef in this metaphor, in this allegory, the only task left with chef is just cooking the thing. And that's it. That's really all there is to dependency injection. It's just a very simple, very, very straightforward concept that, the things that you need, I'm going to give it to you. Okay, you don't have to create them. But of course, like all things, when you try to put it in practice or when you try to put it in computers, it gets a little complex. There are three main methods of injecting dependencies. And before we talk about that, I would really like to take any questions if there are so far. So that we close the concepts and then actually move on to the examples. All good? Okay. So we actually saw one of the methods of injection where we passed all the ingredients, all the objects through the constructor. And that's the first thing, constructor injection. That's like the simplest form. And if you're working with Drupal, this is something you're going to see most often. If you have created a plugin, for example, you've written a plugin, if you have written blocks, chances are that you have used dependency injection, maybe without knowing it. Setter injection is another form. You not pass your dependency through the constructor. You would have a setter method on your class, which would let you specify the dependency. So an example in the previous slides would be that garnish is optional. So you don't pass garnish through the constructor. You would have a method called add garnish, which takes a garnish object. And so this is generally for optional dependencies, where your code will work just fine without without having that dependency. It's not very, very common in practice. There are a lot of examples in Drupal core, by the way. We'll actually look at some examples on how it is used in Drupal core a little later. And the last is property injection. So if you saw a little earlier, these are properties, pastry, fillings, and garnish. They are protected right now, which means I can't access them from outside, which is a good thing. But you could just make them public. And when you create the class, you set these properties with all this new. Oops, that's not what I meant to do. Okay, yeah. So you could, instead of passing it through the constructor, you could just set the properties. The properties you see over there. You could just directly set them, and that's a really bad idea. Okay, take it as a thumb rule if you want to. Always try and use constructor injection. If at any point of time you think that the dependencies are optional and I can get away with setter injection, wait for a moment and think again. Can you break up your object to do simpler tasks? How many of you are familiar with the solid principles? Have you heard of the term? Right. So, do one thing. The class is supposed to be doing one thing, and having an optional dependency is a sign that the class is probably not doing one thing. That said, sometimes you need that. You need the setter injection. You need the setter methods on the class. So, okay, do it, and there are some times where you really need to use it, like circular dependencies. There are times when that dependency again points back to you, and at that time you really have to use set injection. There's no other way. And so far I have never seen a real reason to use property injection, so just don't do it. There are a lot of problems associated with that. One very simple straightforward problem is that if you use property injection, there is the class, the person who writes the class actually has to check each and every property before using it. That just complicates the code. It's just not worth it. So what are the benefits so far? I've been talking about dependency injection, and it might seem like it's the straightforward way to do it, but what are the benefits? First thing is reusable classes. So we actually made our meat pie class, prepare a pie which does not even have meat. We made it with potatoes. You could just use the class, pass in different fillings, and you're done. Another thing is testable, and like I mentioned, Nick, was it Nick? So today, the session earlier today on unit testing, there was a time when you had to inject classes. There was just no way to go ahead with testing, and that's right. So you can't. If the class directly creates its own dependencies, you cannot mock stuff. All those testing related things. So it's really helpful over there. Pluggable systems, plugins, things like plugins are only possible because we are injecting these dependencies, and overall, your code starts becoming more loosely coupled. Again, it's one of the principles of solid, the solid design principles, that your code should be as decoupled as possible with other classes. And if you're injecting your dependencies, if you're not creating it, you're free to move that class somewhere else. You're just going to be working with other dependencies. One very obvious example is database objects. What databases does Drupal support? Can anyone tell me? MySQL is the yes. Yeah. These are all SQL-based databases, but of course, you can write a driver for something like MongoDB, right? Even Redis, why not? So all you have to do is create the database driver class and inject it. You specify, in your settings.php that okay, this is the class I'm going to use, this is the driver I'm going to use that. It's a form of dependency injection. It's not as object-oriented as the examples I've shown so far, but yeah, this is the dependency I'm injecting over here. You can totally write your own driver for your database and go ahead with that. So now we'll actually look at some examples. So again, if you have any questions, now's the time. We'll look at examples, and again, if you have any question at any point of time, feel free. So anyone heard of these frameworks or containers or components or anything, whatever you would like to call them? Pimple, for example. How many of you have heard of Pimple? Okay. Silex. Silex is actually a misnomer because Silex itself uses Pimple. The Pimple is the container. Laravel, anyone worked with Laravel? Oh, okay, a lot of people. And Symfony, of course, like we are at a Drupal event. So, Drupal 8 uses Symfony. So Drupal's dependency injection container is based on Symfony. Silex is a micro framework. It's like a very, very thin framework. If you want to write a very quick application, not a lot of routes, something like that, Silex is a good fit for that. And you still need dependency injection over there, and there are mechanisms there are packages that you can just use, instead of implementing your own container. And I'll talk about what container is in a minute. You can just use Pimple. So, okay, let's because since Laravel's dependency injection is kind of unique, I'll talk about that first, and then I'll talk about Pimple and the other containers. So Laravel does something really cool and magical. Like it's both good and bad in a way. But if you see this parameter to the constructor, module list parser, dollar parser. That's all I have to do to write a controller. So this is a controller. It's a controller in one of my projects, and the name is module status controller, right? And in the constructor I'm specifying I need this service called module list parser. I have not really specified it somewhere, so in Drupal you will see in the next examples that in Drupal you have to specify a services.yaml file, to tell Drupal to give you these services. Laravel, not really. It just automatically creates this class module list parser, and like I said, it's easy to get started. You may face problems later on, like edge cases, and of course they have taken all those things into account. It's not like you cannot get around that. But this is a very, very simple example. Using reflection, they just pass you a new instance of module list parser. The simplest example for dependency injection. Over here, I just save it in this variable and use it in the method when I want to. So the get status method, I just use the parser object as is. So Pimple, so these are the containers that that you'd find it very similar, when you work with something like Drupal. And like I said, Pimple is something used with micro frameworks typically. It's very, very bare bones. All you have to do is create the container and define some services. So this is the syntax of defining services. You can see all these examples on Pimple's documentation as well. So basically, if you can you see the last line at the end? It's this. So all I'm doing is using the container and indexing into a service called session, which actually calls this function. It's returning a new session, and again it's depending on another service called session storage, and that's the whole chain. So it can be recursive. You're requesting a service called session, but internally it's also requesting another service called session storage, and Pimple handles all of this. You don't have to worry about it. All you have to do is write this code and use the object. Okay. So like I said, a Pimple is a reusable container. You can use it with Silex or whatever you wish. But now let's talk about Symfony and Drupal, how they do, how they work with it. Drupal has this concept of definitions, this services definition files, and we usually write it as YAML. How many of you here write modules? Drupal 7 or 8? I'm just getting an idea. Okay, almost all of you, yeah. So if you're writing a Drupal 8 module, chances are that you would definitely be creating a services.yaml file. Just like you would create info.yaml, you would be creating this file, and this is how it looks. It has its syntax, it's very simple to get started, but you need a services key at the top, and then you start defining your services. There is a service called cache context IP, for example, and you tell Drupal, or more precisely, you tell the dependency injection container that this is the class I want to create. So if I say, later on, if I require that I want this service, give me this service called cache context.ip. The DIC, dependency injection container, will look at this file and it will see, okay, I need to create this class. And like the class is Drupal core cache context IP cache context. It will create the class for you. Also, then it reads, there are more definitions, there are more parameters over here. So it sees that it needs these arguments. It needs request stack as an argument. So you see the @ symbol before the request stack? That actually indicates that request stack is another service. Like we saw before, the session service depended on session storage. This cache context.ip service depends on request stack service. So now it's the DIC's job, Drupal's job to, when you request cache context.ip, it also has to create a request stack service and give it to you. Okay, and there are a few more parameters over here like tags and all that, and we'll actually look at that again later on. And how do you use it in your Drupal code? In your module, this is how you do it. This is not how you should do it, and I'll come to that. But this is the simplest way. If you're writing it in your if you want a service in one of your hooks, for example, something that you would write in your module file in procedural code, this is how you would use this. So backslash Drupal, this is the dependency injection container. That's the object. And you call this a static method on that called service, and the service name is module installer, right? And the rest is just a method on the service. So the install method, it's a method on this module installer service. Similarly, this example just does a little bit more. I'm also creating another example over here. It's creating a service of content translation.manager and calling set enabled on that. With me so far? Okay. If I'm going fast, slow, just let me know. Okay, so we'll dig into few more features of this dependency injection container now. So what we saw is the bare bones functionality of this dependency injection container, and it does the job. But you might have seen the services.yaml file. For example, you saw the tags property in the YAML. And you're probably wondering what is all that. So let's see some of them. So services is just a fancy name for an object, usually a singleton object. So if you have a service called plugin manager, default plugin manager, block plugin manager, you might have you used these services by any chance? Yeah, right? So these are actually these are classes. Services is just a fancy name for that, right? And how do you use these services? So this example is from a plugin, and many of the plugins you might have seen will have this create method on them. Like there is the best way to do this is to actually look at examples. This particular class implements a particular interface called Container Factory Plugin Interface, which lets it have this create method. And what this means is that when you write a plugin, you typically won't be able to define it in services.yaml file. You might create a block plugin, for example, and it needs to query certain types of entities. How do you get the entity type manager? Entity type manager is a service. How do you get that in your code? Right? So in your block plugin, you would implement this create method. Okay. And are you familiar with Singleton approach design pattern? How many of you are familiar with Singleton design pattern? Yeah, most of you. So this is basically it. I'm creating the same object again, and I'm passing in all of these. So $container is the correct way of accessing services in Drupal. What we saw earlier, this backslash Drupal, that's not the best way to do it, right? And there are reasons again. The main reason is testability. If you're using this in your object-oriented code, you're breaking testability. Now you don't have any way to override these services anymore. So what you would be doing is you would be using this $container get and then pass the name of services in your code. This $container is passed in by Drupal itself. So Drupal tells, okay, here is a service injection, dependency injection container. Take whatever services you want. And I'm going to create a class with all of these services. There are a lot, and again, it's not usually a good practice to do that, but there you are. So this is like one of the easiest ways to get started. Again, it might seem a little overwhelming. Just look at examples, and you should be fine. And I think we've already discussed this, creating services. All you have to do is in your module create a services.yaml file. Okay, and this is the syntax really. You say you start with the services key and the name of the service, and pass in the classes, the name of the class you want to create against the service and the arguments that it needs. So let's talk about tags. Any questions so far? Okay. Right. Okay. All right. Yeah. So we're actually at the end. There's not a lot left. Tags is something that you will run across quite often in when you're working with Drupal. And are you familiar with hooks? Most of your module developers, but still you're familiar with hooks, right? you have something called hook node load, for example, or hook load. And can someone tell me when is that used? Like, what do hooks do? Yeah, in interest of time, I'm sorry? Yeah, it passes control to the custom code, yeah. Basically, it allows discovery. It lets a caller say that, okay, something has happened, and okay, like now it does not know that these are the modules that need to react to this event. It's just going to let it out, that, okay, module invoke all, the hook name, and all the modules that implement that hook get fired. So tags are used for something similar to that. I mean, you can use it for many things, but this is the common use case. So if you see this HTTP middleware, this particular service called ban, the ban module, it's in Drupal core. How it works is that, when the request comes in, it needs to kick in early enough to see that, okay, is the request going to be allowed or not? And it implements something called HTTP middleware for that. So when the request comes in, it intercepts the request and sees if this user is actually banned. If the user is banned, do not let the request proceed. And this tag is how Drupal finds these particular services. There are actually a lot of HTTP middleware services. It's not just ban. Page cache, dynamic page cache, all of them are implemented as middlewares. They have to intercept the request. So dynamic page cache, it sees a request come in and sees this request is already cached, just sends it back, right? So there are again several tags. Can someone quickly name any other popular tag? There is actually a talk about this tomorrow, I think, Drupal and event dispatcher. So you will probably see event subscriber come up. That's implemented as a tag again. You would put a tag called event subscriber. And like I said, there are lots of tags. You can have tags like these. It's basically like hooks. As you can implement your own hook, you can implement your own tags. Parameters. In arguments, we saw so far that this @ symbol means that it's another service. You can also pass in something similar to variables using the % sign, and that's again usually specified in the same YAML file. The value is given below. If you can see that, the value is usually given below, and it's just replaced. It's like how variables work. Factory, so if this is a very common example, database connection, which we spoke about earlier. So when somebody requires a database service, you don't really know which database we are connecting to, right? It could be MySQL or SQLite or MongoDB even. So there is actually a factory involved first that checks this, because it's defined in settings.php. This method actually checks in settings.php, okay, which class should I return? And you can do that. This is again, frankly, it's not very common. Factory pattern is usually frowned upon, but there are cases when it's useful. Parents, think of this as something like extending a class in your regular object-oriented programming. It's just a reusability thing, so if you, for example, this entity manager, they specify the parent as container.trait. Which calls this method, setContainer. So remember I was talking about the setter injection earlier? This is an example of setter injection. setContainer method, many of classes in Drupal, they have this method. So you don't pass the container in the constructor, but you use a setter method for that, and the dependency injection container always calls it. So it's not for optional dependencies, but it's quite useful if you want to keep your constructor clean, and also want to make sure that you always get that dependency, because Symfony or Drupal will always make sure that this method is run, setContainer. Right. So we are at the end of the presentation. I think we have like 2 minutes. 2 or 3 minutes?
I think the next talk is about to start in 2 minutes. So.
Okay, yeah. So, all right, yeah. So I think we'll have to wrap up. If you have any questions, I'm around. Feel free to reach me. I go with the name @HussainWeb, like I said, on Twitter. Just tweet to me, or you can find me with D.O. on Hussain Web. But a few tips before I wind up. Always use examples to your benefit. It can be a little overwhelming, without a workshop, without a hands-on coding exercise, it's a little difficult to understand. So just follow the examples, okay? Don't rely on this \Drupal or $container. So yeah, $container is available to you at certain times, but don't save that. Again, that's a different topic of discussion, which will take more time. But essentially, the object is that you should never persist the container in your object. It stops. Like the worst effect is that it will stop your garbage collection from happening because of cyclic references. So get the dependencies you want. Just save those dependencies. Don't save the entire container, right? So the example you saw earlier, it just calls $container get and put it in properties. It does not save $container so that it uses it to get all the dependencies later. It's not a best practice. Use constructor injection. The simplest method is often the best method, and use interfaces provided by Drupal. So one interface I mentioned was container factory plugin interface. Again, you will get a lot of this from the examples. Just follow the examples from Drupal core. Don't be intimidated. It's just another block of code. That's all. Thank you.